It doesn't take a historian to know that the end of World War I in 1918 left the world upside down. The old emperors had pretty much been crippled. The United States of America, which was once a collection of 13 little British settler colonies in the New World, had demonstrated its absolute economic colossus and upended the European order. But things were completely changing in the interwar period. The American people recoiled pretty quickly from the war's devastation, retreating from global politics soon after the conclusion of the Great War. President Wilson's League of Nations project was rejected by a Senate wary of foreign commitments. Instead of continuing Wilson's vision of American hegemony over Europe and democracy abroad, the 1920s saw the United States embrace a more isolated prosperity under Republican presidents like Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, who prioritized domestic growth and high tariffs to shield American industries. In Germany, the Weimar Republic stumbled into existence following Germany's defeat in the First World War. The Versailles Treaty imposed upon Germany war guilt, territorial losses, and crippling reparations. This much bred resentment, undermining its fragile democracy, which was imposed upon it by the British and the Americans. Political instability defined the 1920s, with coalition governments collapsing under economic strain and extremist violence from communists and nationalists. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 devastated the middle class of Germany, while the Dawes Plan's American loans offered some temporary relief, but they tied Weimar's fate to U.S. capital. Germany's relations with the U.S. were primarily economic by this point, with American firms like Ford investing in German industry, while Britain and France kept their diplomatic distance. Around the same time, Benito Mussolini took power in Italy, feeding on resentment from the mutilated victory, the idea that Italy was deprived of territories promised to it by the Treaty of London. Economic instability, a gridlocked parliament, poverty rising among workers and farmers, and a general sense of indifference from the monarchy and liberal governments ushered in the rise to power of the National Fascist Party. Mussolini wanted to transform Italy into a powerhouse of economy and culture. He commissioned public works and sweeping reforms to realign Italy's economy with his corporatist and guild socialist economic positions. However, by the turn of the decade, the 1929 Wall Street crash plunged the world into the Great Depression. In America, President Herbert Hoover tried a laissez-faire response, but this of course faltered, paving the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932 and the New Deal, a sweeping program of economic intervention. Roosevelt's foreign policy remained cautious like his predecessors, constrained by the recently passed Neutrality Acts and public aversion to European politics and conflicts. Roosevelt was cautious to remain publicly a domestic president. The U.S. tightened immigration further and reduced trade, straining ties with Japan, whose 1931 invasion of Manchuria provoked American condemnation, but no action. Britain, grappling with its own economic woes, leaned on imperial trade within the British Empire, while Mussolini's Italy actually saw economic stabilization during this period of turmoil. Mussolini, with those aforementioned public works projects, rebuilt the historical districts of Rome and fashioned himself as a man of the people. However, he, along with the British, the French, and the Americans, began to worry about his neighbor 2 doors to the north, Germany. In Germany, the Great Depression obliterated what scraps were left of the Weimar Republic. Mass unemployment, inflation, and despair just fueled extremism from the right and from the left. And by 1933, with political violence occurring almost daily in the streets, Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party seized power. And American businesses, while still profiting from German contracts, grew increasingly wary of this new, rising political force in Central Europe. Hitler's regime rearmed Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, withdrawing from the League of Nations and alarming Britain and France. Mussolini also was alarmed. He feared that Germany would serve to cut down the economic progress he had made in Italy, and thus tried to cozy up to the United States. Il Duce's Italy had thus far actually enjoyed a surprising degree of American admiration, particularly among Italian-American communities, for stabilizing the country and for curbing communism, and Mussolini's economic corporatism and public works actually paralleled Roosevelt's New Deal, leading some to, in the press and publicly, associate the two with one another. The 1934 assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, an ally of Mussolini, which Mussolini rightly believed was the work of the Germans, further pressed Italy to form a defensive pact with America, or maybe with Britain or any other power that could rival Germany in their eyes. Mussolini mobilized troops to his border with Austria and convened the Streltsau Conference with Britain and France. However, his 1935 invasion of Ethiopia eroded this goodwill, alienating him from the Western democracies, and meetings between Mussolini and the Germans, convened by their shared ally of Francisco Franco of Spain, pushed Italy toward realignment alongside Germany instead of against them. In the Reich, Hitler's economic autarky and propaganda resonated with the German people, restoring German national pride. Some U.S. commentators initially even praised Nazi efficiency. The Roosevelt administration grew alarmed by Hitler's aggression. German-American relations remained pragmatic. U.S. firms like IBM and Standard Oil supplied the Nazi economy, and there were certainly cultural exchanges like the 1936 Berlin Olympics, many of which we tend to forget when we just focus on the geopolitics and the military history, but of course these seemingly friendly, or at least cordial relations, masked growing underlying tensions between these two superpowers. The Empire of Japan, meanwhile, aligned closer to Germany, culminating in the 1936 Anti-Comintern Pact, a signal of Axis cohesion against Soviet influence. Germany would then, in no particular order, annex Austria, the Sudetenland, rearm the Rhineland, set up puppet states in Bohemia and Slovakia, and by the late 1930s, Germany invaded Poland, sparking war with Britain and France. Roosevelt in America, still facing isolationist opposition from groups like the America First Committee, edged toward supporting Britain and France through measures like the 1939 cash and carry policy, but he still didn't actually enter the war in Europe. Italy was, of course, pushed by sanctions into the arms of Hitler, formalized with the 1939 Pact of Steel, and Japan's escalating war in China prompted more economic sanctions from America, which could then cripple the oil-dependent Pacific Empire. And so Britain and France pleaded for American aid while the Americans were getting scared of the Japanese, and Roosevelt thus proposed the Lend-Lease plan, but Congress stalled its passing. As German U-boats clashed with U.S. ships in the Atlantic and Japan's ambitions threatened American interests, isolationism in the United States faced its sternest test. Britain began a propaganda campaign appealing to Anglo-American shared heritage and the seeming barbarity of Germany's blitzkrieg. Yet non-interventionists still commanded broad support in American politics, arguing that European conflicts should not dictate American foreign policy, which is really a fundamental axiom of the American political order that traces all the way back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's something that can never be removed from American politics, and thus at this point in history was seeing such a great resurgence because of the intensity of the conflict in Europe. American businesses, though, continued to manufacture for Germany and operate in the country even during wartime. Hollywood produced anti-Nazi films, but American banks extended loans to Germany into the late 1930s. American volunteer groups like the Flying Tigers aided China against Japan, but oil companies still sold to the empire. President Roosevelt thus had to navigate an incredibly delicate political path. His arsenal of democracy rhetoric framed the U.S. as a supplier rather than a combatant, and soon Congress was convinced enough to pass the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, but politically things were tricky. The program provided billions in aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies, and it was a logistical marvel, supplying everything from tanks to food, sustaining Britain's resistance, and enabling the Soviet Union to weather Operation Barbarossa for the immediate future. However, it was deeply controversial, and seen by many as a step toward war and another depression as had come after the First World War and the economic wind-down that followed it. All of that changed, though, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the isolationist consensus on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack, killing over 2,400 Americans, transformed public opinion overnight, uniting the nation behind war against Japan. Congress declared war on Japan the next day, ending those decades of reluctance. Soon after, Germany's declaration of war on the United States on December 11th, 1941 was a pivotal, if perplexing, decision. The tripartite pact with Japan and Italy did not obligate Germany to join Japan's war against the US, as Japan had initiated the conflict. Yet Hitler, addressing the Reichstag, framed the declaration as a response to American provocations, Lend-Lease aid, naval engagements with U-boats in the war in the Atlantic, and Roosevelt's alleged Jewish-influenced hostility. In reality, Hitler saw a Japanese-American war as a strategic opportunity, believing it would divert U.S. resources to the Pacific, easing pressure on Germany's faltering eastern front against the Soviet Union. Ribbentrop's assurances to Japan's ambassador in November 1941 promised German support in a U.S. conflict. Contrary to Hitler's prediction, however, American entry into both the Pacific and European theaters completely reshaped World War II. The U.S. unleashed its industrial titan once again, producing 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, millions of tons of supplies, and they completely dwarfed Axis output. The United States had a total of 150 aircraft carriers at their peak in the Second World War. By contrast, every country in the world today has only 50 aircraft carriers when you combine all of the navies of every single country in the world. America had entire ships whose sole purpose was producing ice cream for troops. The sheer rebalancing of sides which American unbridled entry brought into the war was unimaginable. By the end of the war, and we're jumping ahead a bit, America had a navy large enough that it was said that it could take over the entire world if it wanted to. In Europe, American troops assisted the Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942, while an expanded Lend-Lease program sustained Soviet advances. America effectively conquered Italy, and the D-Day invasion of 1944, involving over 150,000 American soldiers, was the signal flare of Germany's collapse. In the Pacific, U.S. naval victories at Midway and Guadalcanal crippled Japan's fleet. America engaged in island-hopping campaigns, and eventually the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sealed the fate of the Empire of Japan. The Soviets closed in on Berlin, and the Axis fell. In the coming weeks and months, the United States and Soviet Union would uncover the brutality of the Nazi and Japanese regimes, the mass executions, labor camps, pillaging, and genocide which were wrought on the world. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Hitler never declared war on the United States? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Subper, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alfonso Maurice, Sebastian, Atomical Mon Studios 2, PJ the Homeless Mage, and Kennedy the V. Thank you very much, because your support helps us produce videos like these, which cover sensitive topics like World War II. And everyone, please enjoy the video. Even if Hitler had not declared war on the United States, America was likely to have been drawn into World War II against Germany regardless. America was already effectively a belligerent in the Battle of the Atlantic thanks to German U-boat attacks on American shipping. Roosevelt, too, was already deeply involved in supporting the Allies through Lend-Lease and cash and carry, which shipped tons of weapons and supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. These convoys were escorted by U.S. naval vessels, which were targets for German U-boats, who sank numerous merchant ships off the U.S. East Coast and in the Atlantic from 1941 to 42. The peacetime draft of 1940 and naval patrols in the Atlantic already skirted neutrality as well. This much, as one might assume, created a de facto state of hostilities, much as had been in World War I between the U.S. and German Empire before the sinking of the Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram in America's entry into the war. In an alternate timeline, Roosevelt would eventually take a decisive turn toward intervention, regardless of whether or not Germany declared war first, and the public would surely follow, as the sinking of U.S. ships, some within sights of American shores, would completely erode political resistance to war. It was an inevitability that the U.S. was going to join the war in Europe. But this essentially gives us the same outcome as the World War II of our history, with America simply entering the war a few months late. So let's amend our what if, and instead ask, what if the United States and Germany simply didn't declare war on one another at all during the Second World War? This primarily splits the war into two separate wars, even more so than it had been in our own history. The devastation at Pearl Harbor would have still, of course, drawn America in against Japan, but in this alternate timeline, it would be a cry solely against Japan. Thus, the war in the Pacific would, in essence, be one confined from the European, African, Atlantic, and Middle Eastern theaters, with different combatants altogether. Congress would declare war on Japan, and the war in the Pacific would begin. It's not out of the question to assume that Roosevelt would intensify Lend-Lease aid to Britain and the Soviets. However, with such an immediate and pressing need to support a massive naval war with Japan, and with some of the fleet destroyed at Pearl Harbor, and with no declaration of war with Germany, as again our scenario sets up, it's possible that this move would be politically untenable at this moment. And the increase or the decrease or the maintenance level of Lend-Lease does have a huge effect on the scenario. So let's zoom in and sort of take a look at this question before we actually get into the meat and potatoes. Roosevelt's advisors supported the Germany First strategy in our own history, which was prioritizing Europe in World War II due to Germany's greater industrial and military threat. But of course, the absence of a German declaration of war and the fact that in the public and political eye, the only threat right now are the Imperial Japanese, it's more likely to assume the military and primarily the Navy would push for a Pacific First strategy. George Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff, was also very interested in perfecting industrial mobilization. We might assume that his temperament would actually caution against overextending resources to Europe when the US was directly engaged in the Pacific against an enemy that they knew not the actual full-scale capabilities of. So the most likely outcome is we'd see Lend-Lease levels remain the same or decrease slightly as America gears up for total war in the Pacific. And the public, without this declaration of war from Germany, would see the European war as something different and see Japan as the only enemy of America. In the early months of 1942, America would pour its industrial and military might into crushing Japan's navy. The US Navy's goals would be the retaking of the Philippines and then the capture of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. We'd likely still see Britain and Australian involvement in the war in the Pacific, though this wouldn't come for a few months later. But there is a question of whether or not this would be reduced, given that now America isn't actively fighting in Europe alongside Britain, which was Britain's more pressing and immediate front. Regardless, a reduction in British and less likely Australian aid in the war in the Pacific doesn't actually mean that much for America, given again their sheer capability once the industrial might of the country starts getting moving. Speaking of Britain, the British and the Soviet Union would be forced, of course, to fight a European and African war without the same level of US aid, or at least the same commitment of American industrial power, which we can only imagine will begin to wear away at both morale and also British capabilities in North Africa. But even worse, Soviet reorganization after Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union would undoubtedly have to just plead for more aid from the Americans. Unfortunately, however, that aid would likely begin to come with extra conditions. Roosevelt's cabinet would ask for Soviet troops to engage Japan and Manchuria if aid was to be increased. But of course, this was impossible for the Soviet Union, as Stalin was focused on survival by any means necessary against the Wehrmacht. This much could sour US-Soviet relations. Stalin would see himself alone in Europe to fight Germany more so than ever, and America would see the Soviet Union as not negotiating with them. In the Atlantic, German U-boats would tread a delicate line. We can assume that with reduced Lend-Lease, we would also see a reduction in attacks on US-flagged ships to avoid provoking war. But this would do nothing to change American and German relations. They'd inevitably remain icy, with Roosevelt's anti-Nazi rhetoric and tightened sanctions keeping American companies out of German markets. Germany could be facing diplomatic fallout from more sides, even. Over in the Pacific, Japan's foreign minister, Yosuke Matsuoka, could view Germany's refusal to declare war on the US as a betrayal of the Tripartite Pact, even though technically Germany didn't have to declare war. Japan would see this as Axis disunity, though it would not necessarily change their strategy of war. The overstretched Japanese military would press on with its conquests, unable to secure new resources immediately, and thus prioritizing the conquest by any means necessary of oil-rich regions like Malaya, Indonesia, in order to fuel its navy and its need for constant industrial expansion, more so now that America is fighting against them. The straining of the German-Japanese alliance would have an effect on intelligence sharing between the two countries, and while this whole situation wouldn't be the nail in the coffin for Japan or even sever the alliance completely yet, it would isolate Japan further in the Pacific War as it begins to grapple with the full might of American industry and their own domestic oil shortages. This situation would also hurt the third major member of the Axis, Mussolini's Italy. Mussolini, as mentioned in the introduction, was very wary of Hitler. While it would be a stretch to say that he only aligned with Hitler out of necessity, his dedication to the Tripartite Pact was called into question at various points in the war in our own history. And over time, Mussolini himself did become increasingly frustrated with his treatment by Germany and the actions and tendencies of Hitler, especially in his presence under the influence of drugs. Thus, the weakening of the alliance with Japan would likewise threaten, if not immediately, the alliance with Italy. Italy was already battered in a front in North Africa, which they explicitly stated they were unprepared to fight, and these unprepared Italian forces were completely reliant on German support in the theater. Mussolini had even temporarily considered covertly purchasing oil from American companies with Portugal as a middleman to support his war effort, though these prospects were quickly shot down and swept under the rug in our own history. But it is possible, if implausible, that Italy's fuel crisis could push him to take action in this regard eventually. The strain between Japan and Germany would prick fear into Mussolini, but of course it wouldn't yet be enough to destroy the Axis alliance. In fact, within a few months, the Axis may actually retake the upper hand in North Africa, as Britain's grip begins to slip without the same level of Lend-Lease support. As spring 1942 approaches, Rommel, the Afrika Korps, and the Italians could prepare to actually fully retake Libya. And such a turnaround could quickly dissuade Mussolini of any of the fears that had kind of seeped in with the quote-unquote betrayal of Japan. Now, to talk Pacific War, in our own history, the U.S. achieved naval parity with Japan by mid-1942, following victories at the Coral Sea in May and in Midway in June, which halted Japanese expansion entirely. With the United States able to throw its full weight into the Pacific War, the sleeping giant will arise faster and more furiously than ever. President Franklin Roosevelt will channel the nation's $1.2 trillion in GDP into crushing Japan's empire. We might estimate the United States will have produced 15 aircraft carriers, 55,000 aircraft, and 2,000 tanks by 1943, which is an estimate that's sort of just a modest increase from our own history, as constructing ships and aircraft are no easy task, but America will have some extra resources from the absence of increased Lend-Lease. Essentially, we're taking stuff that would be sent to the European theater and putting in the Pacific theater, and it's not having a huge, overwhelming effect, but it is enough to speed up the pace at which Japan was being defeated in the Pacific. This force, of course, will find no difficulty outstripping Japan's 3 carriers and 10,000 planes. The Battle of Midway in June will crush Japan and turn the tide only 6 months into the war, with U.S. codebreakers ambushing and sinking 4 Japanese carriers for the loss of 1. By August, we'd see the Guadalcanal campaign with 40,000 some U.S. troops backed by 600 aircraft, 10 destroyers. They'd seize the island's airfield and rout 30,000 Japanese. And by February 1943, we'd basically wave in the beginning of the island-hopping campaigns. Again, a little bit faster than the Pacific War in our own history, but nothing too crazy. This is a modest increase in American capabilities. To throw out some more random numbers, we could say, submarines would have sunk something around 1.5 million tons of Japanese shipping by this point, crippling Japan's oil supply by mid-1942, and forcing the Japanese archipelago to resort to rationing food and forcing the military to stall offensives. In Europe, the Soviet Union would actually be significantly wounded under these reduced aid circumstances. Lend-Lease provided 17% of Soviet war materials by 1945, including 400,000 trucks and 1.8 million tons of food, along with a lot of US money going directly into the pockets of Soviet soldiers. Say what you will about Soviet capabilities and self-sustenance by the end of the war, but during these 1942 to 1943 counteroffensives, primarily the one at Stalingrad, that Lend-Lease aid was critical for the Soviet Union. Again, say what you will about Soviet forces at the end of the war. Sure, they maybe could have gone on without Lend-Lease, but at this point in the war, if Lend-Lease is reduced, the Soviet Union is going to be forcing some massive consequences. Soviet doctrine was that of deep operations and mass mobilization, and it's really difficult to uphold these doctrines without being able to feed military mouths. The Soviets would likely be capable of fielding somewhere in the realm of 5 million troops, but they would be losing, 1.2 million in 1942 as Germany, also unburdened by US bombing, would be able to deploy even more soldiers, and it would be able to continue producing steel and weapons in Bohemia and the Rhineland. And all of this means that a more powerful, more industrialized Germany could probably capture Stalingrad by December. Stalin would thus have to delay the Stalingrad counteroffensive to something like spring 1943. And Germany would be in a better situation, but again, Germany's big constraint right now is going to be resources, and it's going to be oil, which it doesn't have enough of on the continent, even though it's got huge industrial capabilities and, of course, more people and less bombing campaigns against it. And because of these constraints, there is still a likelihood that the Soviet Union can bounce back later, probably in the summer. By July, somewhere in the realm of 5.2 million Soviet troops would be able to launch a grueling counterattack at Kursk, regaining ground, but of course they'd be suffering 1 to maybe 1.5 million casualties. The Eastern Front was always going to be a bloodbath. Here it would be even more so, with the Soviet Union still capable of just shoving people at Germany, but Germany being more capable of defending its front lines. Even still, though, Zhukov's attrition tactics would be able to exploit German overextension, because Germany was trying to hold on to this huge front line that was really unsustainable for a long period of time. So the Soviets could take this time to prepare inertia for a major counteroffensive. But the tolls would be far, far higher for the Soviets than our own history. Deaths from disease and malnutrition and even starvation would take a huge hit. And this could put the Soviet military on the very brink. Britain would, by this point, also be drained of its gold reserves, and thus forced to scale back RAF raids on German steel plants, allowing the Germans to again continue to produce only meekly hindered. Churchill, of course, wouldn't give up, but convoy losses and an Egypt teetering on the brink as Axis forces captured Tobruk would force war exhaustion to seriously set in Britain. The Italians and Germans were pushing toward El Alamein by 1943, and though there would be a slowdown in Axis progress in North Africa due to mismanagement of supply lines, they would be right where they want to be in terms of North Africa. Italy's Greek campaign would similarly stall around this point, with 150,000 some troops locked in a stalemate as the Germans prioritized the Eastern Front above all else. And this could result in a similar strain of Italian-German relations, but I don't think that's going to be an issue right now, right yet. By late 1943, the US would target the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, overwhelming Japan's forces. There would be a lot more happening in the background, beyond just fronts and soldiers and tanks and supply lines. For example, the Manhattan Project began in 1942 in competition with Heisenberg's program in Germany, and it really sputtered to life with the need for a decisive war-ending weapon against either Germany or Japan. In this alternate timeline, the US would of course still pursue the Manhattan Project, as there would still be those fears of German nuclear research, which would definitely still exist. For example, Albert Einstein's 1939 letter to President Roosevelt. Now, Germany's V-1 program would also likewise continue. And in our own history, testing was limited by fuel shortages in Germany, but the German rocket program was also experimenting with synthetic fuel, and synthetic fuel plants were bombed by US bombers, which wouldn't, in this timeline, be flying over Germany. While it's really hard to say whether or not that would impact the development of the German rocket program, it does mean that some of Germany's weapons research programs wouldn't be interrupted by bombing, and they could then produce results, even if not until late in the war, say 1945 or even 46 if it's still going on by then. Though Germany could just as easily divert these extra resources that were unbombed straight to the Wehrmacht in the east, which was their number one priority. Now, regarding the Manhattan Project, we could see a slowdown slightly because a lot of the urgency of the bomb was this competition with Germany and the need to perhaps take out Germany's industrial centers with one sweeping, nuclear explosion. And the concept of using it to avoid a direct land invasion of Japan didn't come until later in the war. So it is possible again that the timeline of the Manhattan Project slows down slightly, but I would imagine that it wouldn't. I would imagine that the bomb would still be a number one priority. Well, not a number one, but you get it. It would still be a major priority for the United States at this time. Now, on a much darker note, without the bombing campaigns, the Holocaust would be permitted to accelerate, with Germany diverting resources to murder millions more Jews by 1943. Germany would have no urgency to quickly and sloppily cover up their genocide. Instead, Himmler could, as he had intended, meticulously hide the artifacts of the Holocaust as the war went on. There is thus, in this alternate timeline, the possibility that the Holocaust remains literally unknown to the world in the immediate aftermath of the war, regardless of who wins, unless somehow demographic data is able to be compared and there is an actual investigation by historians later in time to search into what happened to the Jews of Europe during this period. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, the same signals, the same abandoned camps and mass graves that the Soviets and the Americans and the British stumbled upon would not be there. They'd be meticulously covered up, regardless of who wins. They'd be meticulously covered up by Himmler and the SS. In the US, we will also see the Japanese internment system. In 1942, 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned under Executive Order 9066. It is without a doubt that, with Japan as the sole enemy of America, these internment camps will still be constructed. But jumping back into geopolitics a little bit, with Japan backsliding in the Pacific by this point, German-Japanese relations will fray, with Germany offering scant Pacific support in order to prevent escalation with the Americans in this decisive moment against the USSR. As 1944 dawns, the United States will have thoroughly cemented its dominance in the Pacific, wielding an unmatched war machine against a crumbling Japanese empire. The Mariana Islands campaign in June 1944 would see American forces capture Saipan and Tinian by August, enabling B-29 firebombing of Tokyo by October, which could kill upwards of 100,000 by 1945. Japan's economy would collapse, with millions homeless and industry completely decimated, prompting Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's resignation. The Manhattan Project could produce 2 atomic bombs, and the United States would then drop them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender on July 20th. The Treaty of San Francisco would demilitarize Japan and establish U.S. occupation under General Douglas MacArthur, with the aim of investing to rebuild Japan as a market for American goods. However, starvation and malnutrition would be widespread across Japan. Luckily enough, the years of 1944 to 1947 were years of agricultural surplus in the United States, which would allow America to deploy these resources to Japan to quell unrest and distribute food and supplies. The Eastern Front would see the Soviet Union cling on to survival, losing millions of citizens to starvation by 1944 and leading the Bagration Offensive to liberate Belarus. But the victory would be, of course, Pyrrhic. By 1945, Soviet advancement would reach Poland, but there they would face several million entrenched German forces, catching both sides in what would be a meat grinder, with neither gaining a decisive edge. Germany would be able to hold Ukraine, but even with an intact industrial machine, it would suffer potent oil shortages by this point. However, the Axis would also, by this point, have seized Egypt, defeating the British at El Alamein and controlling the Suez Canal, which would allow them to potentially take advantage of Middle Eastern oil assets. The oil fields which were crucial to Britain's war effort were in Iraq and Iran, mostly in Persia with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Germany could attempt to advance to Iraq, perhaps supporting a second Golden Square coup, the first of which occurred in 1941 and saw Iraq briefly under German allied nationalists. And assuming Germany can come to control Palestine, the Germans could then secure roughly 500,000 barrels per month from Iraq by late 1944 by redirecting troops and ships to cut off the British completely. And they could also seize some British shipments that would be coming through the Suez before those would all be rerouted around South Africa. These oil supplies would partially alleviate their shortages, but of course they would not fully resolve the deficit. Only by breaking Soviet control over Iran could this occur, though such a breakthrough would be completely unfeasible given the terrain, given German capabilities, given German logistics, and also British forces in India and the Arabian Peninsula. But in the short term, we might see Germany regain a slight upper hand in Poland, pushing the Soviets back into Belarus or back, towards eastern Poland, but again, advances would slow as 1945 progressed. V-2 rocket barrages could disrupt Soviet logistics, but they wouldn't greatly shake the balance because the Soviet Union's main strength was just throwing people at the front lines. Stalin and Hitler would thus find themselves in a deadlock, and if Germany couldn't produce air superiority and produce really the bombers that America was able to produce that really gave them a headwind in the war in Europe, Germany wouldn't be able to outlast the Soviet Union, because it would be a primarily land combat war. Britain would be in an even worse situation than both of those powers. Bankrupt and ostensibly booted out of North Africa, they would be unable to follow through with planned campaigns in Sicily. Churchill would be forced to surrender not just his country, but also his office, with Clement Attlee being elected in July 1945. And in August of that same year, we might imagine that the British would simply sue for peace, negotiating terms with the Third Reich. Britain would be allowed to retain India and Australia, but would be forced to cede their African colonies to a pro-Axis regime, possibly some going to Vichy France, some going to Germany, with the Germans likely also taking any oil assets that Britain could hand over to them. Egypt and Palestine would come under German rule, and Germany could turn its full military attention to the east as the Mediterranean was reorganized under joint Italo-German-French control. Germany would also have finished production of its Me-262 jet fighters by 1945. Though with Britain's RAF out of the war, there would be no strategic advantage in using jet fighters against the Soviets. If Germany had the foresight, which it wouldn't in this alternate timeline, or in our own history, to develop bombers instead of fighters, it might be able to gain an upper hand against the Soviets, but right now it's just completely unfeasible. There would be a small setback in the Mediterranean with Italy's Greek campaign likely collapsing in retreat, requiring Mussolini to appeal to the Germans, but I'm not sure this would really have much bearing because they could just hold this off for later. The East was again the number one priority. The biggest issue that would be going on in 1945 and in 1946 would be a huge refugee crisis simultaneously engulfing Europe, with tens of millions by 1945 being displaced. Refugees of the war, fleeing Poland, fleeing Ukraine, fleeing any area devastated, into Sweden, into Switzerland, into Turkey, overwhelming camps, facing malnutrition and death from disease. Neutral countries would be forced to impose quotas. Black markets would pop up. There would be pogroms. There would be illegal labor. The situation in Europe would be it would be a mess. It would be a mess. And the war would not show any signs of stopping. The millions of Soviet soldiers would prevent the collapse of the Soviet war effort, but would be incapable of advancing. And without German nuclear bombs or long-range, highly capable bombers like the Americans had, the stalemate would persist. This Soviet-German stalemate would leave the Americans total control of the terms of the end of the war in the Pacific. By early 1946, war crime trials in Tokyo would prosecute high-ranking officials involved in various crimes in China, Korea, the Philippines, and those still alive responsible for ordering the attack on Pearl Harbor. Land reforms in Japan would dismantle the Zaibatsu system, redistributing 4 million acres of land to tenant farmers in an effort to foster a middle class in Japan, but at the expense of the would-be loyalty of the now displaced Japanese elites. Politically, the United States would probably draft a new constitution enacted in that May 1946, which would establish a parliamentary democracy and renounce war under Article 9, similar to, again, our own history. Emperor Hirohito would remain a symbolic figurehead, which was a decision driven by MacArthur to maintain social cohesion in Japan. However, we'd probably see leftist movements begin to gain traction in the social and economic turbulence, with the Japanese Communist Party securing a portion of the vote in the first post-war election. The Americans would of course counter this by interfering and bolstering moderate factions, ensuring a pro-American government would arise under Prime Ministers Shigeru Yoshida, and the US would also be forced to consolidate control over former Japanese territories, like Taiwan and the Kuril Islands, both of which would probably be placed under direct US administration, while the Philippines would of course be granted independence in July 1946, aligning itself closely with Washington through military and trade agreements and an installed pro-US government. The Navy would expand and repair bases in Guam and Okinawa and project power across the Pacific Rim. However, domestic pressure would, by this point, be mounting to reduce military spending, with the US public, weary from war, demanding a peace dividend. Now, President Harry Truman, succeeding Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, would have to balance demobilization with the maintaining of an American Pacific presence, and also his tendencies towards interventionism and anti-communism. Around this time, Europe is going to be facing essentially total collapse. Germany, under Hitler's increasingly erratic leadership, would be completely frustrated with the stalemate in the East. Stalin's strategy, of course, by this point hinged near solely on attrition, leveraging the Soviet Union's expendable population resources. By mid-46, another massive offensive in Belarus could probably repeat the same Pyrrhic tolls of 1944, and Truman would likely be forced to end Lend-Lease at this point, trying to cut spending. But of course, this does not mean Germany gains another upper hand. The Reich's economy, which was propped up by the plundered resources and what were effectively slave laborers, was also right on the edge of inflation. Vichy France would be made to provide troops to the garrison in North Africa, freeing German forces for the East, but soon all of the cards would come crashing down. The German government would, that August, face economic collapse, with the Reichsmark's value plummeting. Spain would halt tungsten shipments, a coup attempt would rock Berlin, and the Soviets would force their final counteroffensives. Soviet forces advancing on a 500-mile front would encircle German troops in Poland, capturing Warsaw and throwing the Wehrmacht out of order. War exhaustion would have thoroughly set in Germany, and Hitler, now incapacitated by Parkinson's and amphetamine addiction, would refuse to evacuate Berlin, as the Soviets, now with the advantage of momentum, would push toward the city. Soviet artillery would, upon reaching Berlin's outskirts, launch a 10-day bombardment, leveling 70% of the city. Heinrich Himmler and the SS would exit toward Vichy France. Italy would find itself collapsing concurrently. Mussolini, fleeing Rome after a coup by monarchists, would be captured by partisans and executed. The Italian fascist government would surrender to Soviet emissaries in Athens, while Victor Emmanuel III would declare the Kingdom of Italy returned. Germany would lie in ruins, both its industrial heartland and Bohemia devastated by Soviet bombardment and looting. The Reich, formally dissolved soon after the capture of Berlin, would see Soviet forces occupy the eastern tip of Germany, establishing a provisional administration in Berlin, but without the resources to govern much outside the city. In the west, SS remnants, led by Heinrich Himmler, would declare almost warlord-like enclaves in Bavaria and the Rhineland, controlling ideologically loyal troops and extorting local resources in the chaos. These enclaves, though, would lack centralized command, and most would collapse by 1950 to partisan forces. Germany would thus sit utterly divided into a Soviet-occupied slight east and an effectively lawless west, where 15 million would face starvation, as nationalists and partisans and SS factions would vie for control in total and utter chaos. Eastern Europe would become something of a weak Soviet sphere, completely unstable as the Soviet Union would barely be able to project power within its own borders, its population and industry completely desolate from the war, and millions still starving. Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus would be under Red Army occupation and facing famine. Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria would also face some influence from the Soviet Union being the primary power in the East, though with barely any troops to spare, there would be no occupation or a very weak one at best, and Soviet-installed governments would be barely effective outside of the capitals should they be established. It's more likely that nationalist movements and general disorder would take over in these formerly Axis-allied states. With simply no prospect of exerting any influence over Italy, Stalin would have no choice but to allow Victor Emmanuel III to be restored as the king. Emmanuel would attempt to reconsolidate control, and though northern Italy would have been spared heavy fighting and might align with his cause, the south, which during the war was heavily reliant on German aid, would be facing, like most of Europe, famine, with potentially upward of 1 million deaths by 1949. The king would also be aged 78 by this point, and thus would abdicate the throne in June 1948, passing the crown to Umberto II. Umberto would of course lack legitimacy and struggle against communist and republican factions, which would come to control Turin and Naples respectively. By 1950, Italy would fracture into a shaky monarchy in the north, a communist stronghold in Emilia-Romagna, and a republican south. Vichy France would dissolve in June 1948 as Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle would seize Paris. Croatia and Slovakia would descend into anarchy. Soviet troops would come to occupy Slovakia and Bohemia, but in the Balkans and former Yugoslav states, local warlords like Croatia's Ustaše would attack from rural areas, threatening the militaries of Serb nationalists and other groups. Spain, Portugal, and Turkey would seemingly be the least scathed in Europe, perhaps forming an economic and political pact of sorts in order to deal with the refugee crises and other various shared issues these neutral countries would face. Even Switzerland, though, would be affected, finding trade with other nations difficult in an unstable European continent with essentially lawlessness on all of its borders. The Soviet army overstretched across Eastern Europe would, just as the Germans had only a few years earlier, lack fuel, have awful morale, and would be subject to a plethora of desertions. Stalin would enact purges to suppress dissident, but by 1950, the Soviet economy would be in stagnation, unable to rebuild or project power beyond its immediate satellites. Stalin's health, deteriorating from stress, would force him to contend with secession of the premiership. The Soviet Union, though, was itself on the chopping block of instability like Germany before her. The Chinese Civil War would have resumed by 1946 with the end of Japanese occupation. The nationalists, or the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, controlled southern China, while the communists under Mao Zedong dominated the north. Japan's defeat would leave 2 million tons of captured equipment split almost evenly between both sides. By 1948, the communists with 3 million troops could seize Manchuria, perhaps, though without Soviet backing, this would be a more difficult task, and it's more likely the United States would support something of a republican or independent state in this region. The nationalists were likewise backed by $500 million in U.S. aid. But we ought not underestimate the sheer amount of corruption and warlordism in the nationalist camp. Truman would also be both politically and militarily wavy of overextension after the Pacific War, and hence would likely avoid direct military involvement in the Chinese Civil War. The conflict thus might remain simply unresolved, with the South and North slowly solidifying borders as the communists take Beijing and Xinjiang devolves into anarchy. Korea would remain under U.S. occupation with no Soviet forces in the north to contest. The U.S. would establish the Republic of Korea under Syngman Rhee, which would stretch across the entire peninsula, a welcome change from our own history, though it would see relatively less investment than Japan due to its smaller population. Indonesia, under Japanese occupation until the end of the war, would declare independence in August 1945 under Sukarno. The United States would likely recognize Indonesian independence by 1950 in an attempt to sort of cultivate relations with these newly emerging Southeast Asian and East Asian states, which could then form an economic bloc with, similar to how the Marshall Plan propped up Europe as a market for American goods following the end of the Second World War in our own history. Indochina would soon also fall under Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, and though Truman was very wary of communism, with no true communist benefactor in either China, because communist China would not border Indochina, or in the Soviet Union, because they would be utterly incapable of supporting any communist movements abroad, the United States might very well leave Vietnam alone, or perhaps assign this task to nationalist China. Britain, under Clement Attlee's Labour government, would be bankrupt. The various colonies ceded to Germany would now be effectively without ruler, as Germany had just collapsed. And under normal circumstances, those would be returned to British rule following Germany's defeat, but Britain simply couldn't afford to retake these colonies. In fact, it couldn't afford the colonies it was left with either. By 1948, Britain's GDP would be half its pre-war level, with the Royal Navy reduced to just a few hundred ships patrolling the Indian Ocean mostly. Public morale and the economy would fuel strikes and protests in the British mainland. India's independence movement would escalate, and soon Attlee would be forced to grant the Raj independence in August 1949, partitioning India and Pakistan, which would trigger almost 1 million refugee deaths. Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Canada, Rhodesia, these various still intact British colonies or former British colonies would probably be forced to pivot and strengthen their economic ties with the United States. The other African colonies would soon collapse into chaos, with hundreds of thousands of deaths from tribal conflicts in Nigeria, Kenya, and elsewhere. There are a ton of other ramifications from this scenario that I simply can't get into because of time. You can obviously extend this into the Cold War, which is kind of hard to do because of all the changes and, the butterfly effect. But immediately, in the current moment, the debt from Lend-Lease that can't be paid off, it's going to affect the American economy going forward. There are some intense political ramifications with whatever world order manages to emerge. America is, of course, shifting its focus to becoming a Pacific power of sorts. There's the civil rights movement, Double V protests, a global southern axis that could emerge from the rubble of colonialism and the insane upheaval and warlordism that will emerge in Africa. There's everything that's going to happen in India, the refugee crisis in Europe, the coups that were happening in Iran around this time, instability in Iraq and Egypt. We didn't even mention Australia or Canada that much, let alone the absolute change now that the Soviet Union is only a regional power in Eastern Europe and cannot afford to project power to places like Cuba or Nicaragua, etc. There is, the possibility of the emergence of a customs union in the Benelux or France, maybe an earlier groundwork for a Western European Union out of the chaos, a Pacific evangelism from American Protestants, which would find its way into Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Korea, etc. There's the absence of the Marshall Plan and really U.S. apathy toward Europe. Maybe America taking over Hong Kong from the British, the Soviets not getting the bomb. You get it. There are all sorts of things that are going to go differently. The world has been completely uprooted, left in a state of total disrepair. No amount of humanitarian aid or foreign intervention can really solve this problem. Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia have now been left in what is essentially a worldwide Russian civil war. Not in that Russia is fighting everyone, but in the sense of the utter chaos and unpredictability of that conflict, the partisanship, the splitting of sides, the ideology, the nationalism. It's going to be chaos, pretty much. It's going to be chaos. The slate is truly, truly blank, in both a negative and a positive way. But at least the rubble is still there to build upon. What is built, and what will come next, is up to fate. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for now. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.